Hello and welcome to this Connection special. I'm Patricia Gras. Dr. Robert Van Pelt is a world-renowned expert on Auschwitz, one of the Holocaust's most lethal camps. In a high-profile Holocaust denial case tried in the British High Court in 2000, Dr. Van Pelt served as an expert witness to present evidence that Auschwitz was an extermination camp, primarily using gas chambers to kill up to 1 million Jews. His latest book, The Case for Auschwitz, Evidence from the Irving Trial, has been described as one of the finest expert witness reports to ever reach publication. Dr. Van Pelt, thank you for joining us in The Connection.
Thank you, Pat.
I understand you're an architectural historian, but you became involved with Auschwitz through architecture. Explain that connection to me.
When I started teaching architecture, this was in the mid-1980s, I actually got interested in the question of architectural ethics. And I was in an architecture school, and I asked, do you have a course on architectural ethics? And they said, yes, we have something, but I said, so what's the content of it? And they said, it's about not overbilling the client. And I thought there should be something more to architectural ethics, so I went looking for the worst thing an architect had ever done. And that was what I still believe to be designing the gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz, buildings which were created with the explicit purpose to exterminate people.
Now, you focus on crematorium too, for any particular reason. That was your thesis, right?
No, my thesis actually is on the Temple of Solomon.
Oh.
So yes, I wrote my thesis on the Temple of Solomon. Actually, originally I'm a historian of ideas, but writing on the cosmic speculations on the Temple of Solomon in the mid-80s made me perfectly unemployable in any European university. So I came first to the United States and then to Canada, and fashioned myself as an architectural historian. And so ultimately ended up at the University of Waterloo in Canada, where they gave me the opportunity to work then also on Auschwitz and the history of the gas chambers.
Let's talk about David Irving, since the trial is called the Irving trial. Who was David Irving? What does he represent?
Who is David Irving? He's very much alive right now. David Irving actually is quite an interesting man, I think. He is I would say, in many ways, a brilliant young man who was a brilliant writer and a historian, a self-taught historian who in the early 60s produced a book on the bombing of Dresden. And in this book, he described the bombing of Dresden by the Allies in 1945 as an Allied war crime. And this gave him access to groups of ex-Nazis, people who had not really been speaking in public since the end of the war, who basically trusted him with their papers. And so Irving got a reputation of being able to get hold of archival stuff no other historian had seen. He started to work on that stuff and came out in 1977 with a book, which is an interesting book, called Hitler's War. In that book, he basically had a rather odd thesis, and that was that Hitler had really not known about the Holocaust, that the Holocaust had happened behind Hitler's back, that it had been created by Himmler, the chief of the SS, and Goebbels, and that Hitler only knew about the Holocaust in late 1943 and was in some way upset about it. To quote Irving, Adolf Hitler was the best friend the Jews ever had in the Third Reich. And so this was an attempt on Irving's part to, in some way, whitewash the Führer's reputation, and that brought him into the orbit of hardcore Holocaust deniers. And the big problem, Holocaust deniers had been around since the 1960s. In France, in the early 70s, a man called Faurisson had been publishing books in which he denied the Holocaust. But the big problem the deniers had up to that time is that no historian had ever endorsed their position. And that's, of course, a problem. If you make a thesis about the revision of history and no historian,
there's no evidence,
and the historians don't take you seriously, then you remain an outsider. So Irving, who had a reputation as a historian, was a person who seemed to be like a fellow traveler. He said the Holocaust had happened, but Hitler didn't know about it, which meant it was in some way something which wasn't connected to the core of the Nazi state. It was like a traffic accident. It was a criminal act within the Nazi state, but it was not an act of the Nazi state. And so they started to woo Irving, and then in 1988, Irving publicly and officially joined their side during a trial in Toronto, which was a trial by a Holocaust denier named Ernst Zundel, and Irving was asked to come in as an expert witness on Zundel's side, and then during that trial basically endorsed a report written by another expert, Mr. Leuchter. Errol Morris made a movie about it, Mr. Death, and Mr. Leuchter had been to Auschwitz and he had written a forensic report on the camp in which he said that the gas chambers could not have worked and the crematoria could not have worked, hence there had been no gasings in Auschwitz, and as a result of it, of course, there had been no gasings at all. That the Holocaust was a myth. And Irving comes into that courtroom in April 1988 and he endorses the Leuchter report and he says, this is a document of world-shattering importance. I am now convinced on the basis of this forensic report that the Holocaust did not happen. So that was an important moment for the deniers because now they had a historian who had endorsed their position and they felt that now in some way the future was theirs.
They felt empowered. What happened with that trial in Toronto?
Now, Zundel was convicted. This is a very weird kind of old Canadian law, the law against spreading false news. The law dated from the War of 1810 or 11 when you guys invaded our country. And of course, people were creating rumors to help the invasion of the American troops over the Niagara River. And so this was, spreading false news was a crime in Canada. So afterwards, on appeal, this law was struck down as unconstitutional. So free speech finally came into Canada too, and Zundel was set free. What is the important after effect of this story is really what happens to Irving. Irving becomes the poster boy of Holocaust denial after he has made a statement in 1988. And in 1993, a scholar from now Emory University, Deborah Lipstadt, publishes a book on Holocaust denial. Right. And she identifies Irving as the most dangerous of Holocaust deniers. And it's not a reason because he's done so much original work on it, because he is a great theorist about it, but because he lent his reputation to it. He was the Holocaust denier who, so to speak, could get into people's living room. He had a reputation to lose. Mm-hmm. So she identifies him as the most dangerous, as a liar, a falsifier of history, a couple of charges he makes. And then in 1996, Irving decides to sue her in England.
For libel.
For libel. And the libel laws in England are kind of interesting. They're different from the United States. And the most important difference is that as a plaintiff, you can just basically make your complaint and sit back because it's on the defendant, the person who has written the allegedly libelous text, to basically explain that the text was not libelous. In the United States, the plaintiff has to prove that the text was libelous. In England, the defendant has to prove that it was not libelous. So Lipstadt now had to defend herself and Penguin Books and had to get a team together to prove that indeed whatever she said about Irving was true. And so the defense then decided to basically concentrate one of the aspects of the case on this issue of Irving's conversion to Holocaust denial, his official conversion in Toronto. And the question really became the following. Would any professional historian or any kind of legitimate historian, any honest historian, have made that kind of statement he made in the courtroom, which is, indeed, there were no gas chambers in Auschwitz, or maybe there were gas chambers, they were not used to kill people, on the basis of the evidence Mr. Leuchter had presented in that courtroom. The assumption is that as a historian you have a public responsibility. And your public responsibility is that you look at evidence, you weigh evidence, there's always different kind of evidence, like you're a jury, and at a certain moment you come to a conclusion on the basis of a careful kind of analysis of the evidence. You know, for example, if a historian of the United States, the history of the United States, a person who has worked also on, let's say, the historian of on the history of the South, gets up tomorrow, and let's say this is a professor at a major university, gets up tomorrow and said slavery didn't exist, this would be an enormous public kind of issue. It would be an outcry. So as a historian, you have a responsibility towards the past, and the past presents itself to you in the shape of evidence.
Right.
So that became the issue. So I was called in as one of the 4 historians who became expert witnesses to actually look at this question of what is the evidence about Auschwitz? What is the evidence available to any historian in 1988? Mm-hmm. Yeah? At the time that Irving was in that courtroom, evidence he should have considered before he actually made a judgment about the Leuchter report. And so it really became, the question became really about how do we do history? You know, what is the responsibility of a history? What is the vocation of the historian in some way? So my task became, first of all, what is the evidence? What is then also the value of that evidence? Because, of course, about something like Auschwitz, like with any historical event, there is solid evidence, and there's also evidence which is
testimonial evidence.
Testimonial evidence. There's the eyewitnesses.
Archives.
Sometimes eyewitnesses get confused.
Right.
You know, so the idea was make first a collection of all the evidence there is, all the different classes of evidence, and then start looking at the evidence. And then once I had done that, so described basically the history of evidence about Auschwitz during the war, what did people know during the war, and after the war, what kind of forensic investigations were done by the Russians and the Poles in 1945 and 46, then go to the question, okay, how did Holocaust deniers up to 1988 deal with that evidence? Because Irving could have said, of course, I have read, books by Mr. Faurisson, and I've read books by Mr. Butts, Holocaust deniers, who had twisted and contorted the evidence. And so also, in some way, he should have asked himself the question, is what they do with the evidence legitimate, or should I have asked some very tough questions about that?
Exactly. And you came in with certain kind of evidence that you had studied throughout your research on Auschwitz. Tell me about what evidence you brought to the trial. There was a lot of different people that brought evidence, but you had specific tasks.
Yeah. In 1996, Deborah Dwork, who's professor of Holocaust history at Clark University and established their Center of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the first in the United States, and I published a book which was entitled Auschwitz 1270 to the Present. That collaborative effort went back to work we started in the late 1980s, basically when the wall went down. And I was interested, as I told you at the beginning of this conversation, in the issue of the role of architects in Auschwitz. And I first studied, in 1988, I went to Vienna to study the trial of two of the architects, who were, by the way, acquitted, Austrian justice here in 1970. And after that, I went to Auschwitz to study actually the blueprints of the crematoria and of the camp. By a miracle, all of that material survived, and survived half of it in Poland and half of it in the Soviet Union, and that material became available in 1991. The reason was very simple. The architecture office where they designed the camp was located around 500 yards from the camp itself. And so when in literally 60 years ago today, the SS withdrew from the camp and the Red Army was approaching, they burned everything, but the architecture office had been closed 3 months earlier because there was nothing to build anymore in the last months of the war. And the architects had been drafted into the SS to fight the Russians. So the building was empty, there was no one there who could say, okay, there's also stuff in the basement here. So when the Red Army moved in, they found in the Kommandantur basically all the ashes of all the papers of the Kommandantur, but in the architecture office, there were 300 boxes with blueprints, bills, architectural briefs, and so on. So, in the history of the Holocaust and in the history of concentration camps, this is a unique collection. And so what Deborah Dwork and I did in the early 90s was basically reconstruct the history of the camp through the lens of the construction. When prisoners arrive, barracks need to be built. When at a certain moment the SS decides that they want to kill people, massacre people on a large scale, they need to get crematoria, gas chambers, and so on. And so what we try to do is write this history and looking through the construction, but through the construction and then reconstruct the whole history of the camp. So this was the reason that in 1998, when I was asked to join the trial, I had a reputation in the field. That's why I could be an expert. Now, the reason why this is particularly important, the architectural evidence, is because the deniers love it. Why? Now, let's try to put ourselves in the position of a denier. How do you prove that something didn't happen? It's actually quite difficult. Because you cannot bring a witness forward who said this didn't happen. You cannot have a witness to a non-event. Witnesses are always to things that happen. Now, originally in the 1970s, they brought two people forward, a Mr. Steklich and a Mr. Christophersen in Germany, who both had served in Auschwitz. In the army had flak units, and they were basically anti-aircraft batteries in 1944. And they said, I was in Auschwitz, and I was there for a month or two, and I didn't see anything bad happening. It seemed to be a very cheerful.
That was enough.
That was for them enough, but still, you can argue. I mean, it was very clear. These guys, were not at the right place. They were not actually in Auschwitz-Birkenau where the killing took place. So the fact that they didn't see anything didn't mean that didn't happen. Right. It just happened behind their back.
Right.
So the problem, if you go back to what we call epistemological problem, the problem of what is evidence, deniers have a great problem with witnesses because they cannot bring forward witnesses who say it didn't happen because they don't really exist. So what they have to do is to say that all the witnesses who said it did happen, and there were 100,000 survivors of Auschwitz, are liars. And why are they lying? Now, the Jews are lying because they're Jews. The Germans who testified to their crimes, like Commandant Hus, they lied because they were afraid of being killed. They said anything like in a show trial.
Because Hess came and said, yes, this happened.
Yeah, he wrote his memoirs.
He was very proud of it.
Yeah, like 300-page long memoirs. But they say that Hus wrote it in the same way as Bukhanin in the show trials in Stalinist Russia confessed all kinds of crimes he had never committed. They basically said it's a show trial. So once you remove all the eyewitnesses as legitimate evidence, then the question is what remains. Now, what remains in the case of Auschwitz are these architectural plans and, of course, the ruins. So now what they try to, and they cannot protest. This is what they call, material. This is non-intentional evidence. We call it in history. It was not created in order to be evidence.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
The Germans created it in order to build a camp, and you can, of course, turn it around the way you want it. You can reinterpret it. You can turn the evidence against itself. And so that's what they have been doing. So they try first, they would go, for example, to these blueprints, which I've been working on with Deborah, and they said, okay, we look now in the basement of Crematorium 2. People alleged there was a gas chamber, but the spaces in that blueprint are not called gas chamber, they're called morgue. So obviously there were no gas chambers there. So then, of course, we have to do some explanation to say, yes, originally these were intended to be morgues. They became gas chambers afterwards, but didn't make a new set of drawings. Okay, so that's one thing. The second thing is they started to say is, okay, there in the plants there are these ovens, but these ovens they only could have incinerated over the history of a camp 100,000 people instead of 1 million people. So you have to go now into oven technology. Why is it that the Auschwitz ovens could actually have incinerated so many more people? And one of the reasons is because you have many corpses being incinerated at the same time.
Right.
And of course many of the victims were children. They were small. Then we go to the next thing. They are going to the ruins, and that was what Mr. Leuchter had done, and they start to take samples from the wall. So they go to a space which is a gas chamber, allegedly, they say, an alleged gas chamber, and they take some samples and they see if there's any cyanide in the wall. Now, when you go to Auschwitz and there are gas chambers where clothing were deloused, you find big blue spots on the wall.
Right.
So if you take a sample from that, the blue is actually a cyanide compound, ferrocyanide. So you put that in a laboratory tube, and then there comes out like 5,000 parts per million of cyanide. So then they go to a homicidal gas chamber, and they take a sample, and there's virtually no cyanide in the wall. There's no blue coloring. So they said, there's a proof. There was no gassing in there. The question which they didn't ask at the time, and which we had to ask in the trial, is why is there no cyanide in that wall? Now, the answer is, chemically kind of complex, but after a long story, it is basically because the ferrocyanide will not form if there's a lot of carbon dioxide available in that space. And carbon dioxide, of course, will be there in a high concentration when there are people in that gas chamber. So that's why you will not get that blue coloring in a homicidal gas chamber.
So you use less than more.
Yes, yeah.
And they use Zyklon. It's called Zyklor B.
Zyklon B. That was the cyanide
that was used to kill.
Yeah.
Could you explain real quickly what the process was? I understand they would arrive at the camp and they would take him. directly to the gas chambers. Explain the process, because to understand the trial, you have to understand how they were exterminated.
Yeah, now the word extermination, of course, is a very loaded notion also. I mean, because we exterminate vermin, so when we talk about the extermination of human beings, it means in some way that we already take the German perspective. Yeah, so I prefer the word killing. People arrived in Auschwitz, and typically these this transport of Jews would be subjected to a selection. And in the selection, children, mothers with children, and older people would immediately be sent to the gas chambers, and people who could still work would be admitted into the camp, tattooed, and they would be used as slave labor until they were finished, and they would also be sent to the gas chamber. Now, the gas chambers themselves were in buildings called crematoria, and there were two different kind of models in Birkenau, Auschwitz-Birkenau, but I will just talk about one. This was a building you could see at the end of the train track, so people who arrived could see those two buildings, Crematorium 2 and Crematorium 3, and they looked like
normal buildings,
relatively normal buildings, like German architecture, kind of high-match steel. They would go to that building, they would go into a separate compound surrounded by barbed wire, and then they basically would descend into a basement. And the first basement in which they descended is a basement which was originally planned as a morgue, but now it was used as an undressing room. So there were hooks on the wall, and there were benches, and you had to undress, and they basically told you, hang your clothing on your hook, remember the number because you will come back here, tie your shoes together.
They were lied to.
So they were lied to. Right. And then they would be brought, and this would be, up to 2,000 people in that one room, and then they would be brought or driven, if they protested, into a second basement, and that second basement was the gas chamber. And people would be let in the gas chamber, the door would be closed, and then the gas would be introduced through kind of hollow columns from above, because these gas chambers were, basically sticking from under the building, so there were holes in the roof.
Holes where you drop the poison gas.
The gas came as a kind of granular substance, so there were tins of it, and they would simply open the tin and drop the contents of the tin inside that column, and then the gas would evaporate from this granular substance. That was what Zyklon really was.
How long would it take to kill the people?
10 minutes around. It depends on which concentration you use, and the Germans were rather cheap. See, when cyanide is used in the has been used in the United States in gas chambers, like for example in Missouri. There they will typically use up to 60,000 parts per million, and that is basically you take one gulp and you're dead. That, of course, is because the United States Constitution talks about no unusual, cruel and unusual punishment. In Auschwitz, they use 300 parts per million. So this is 1/200 of it. 200s? Yeah, 1/200 of it. Which means that people would die a very slow and agonizing death. But that is, it's much cheaper for the Germans to do it that way.
Did any Gentiles die in Auschwitz?
Oh, yes. Up to 1 million Jews died, mostly in the gas chambers. And around 100,000 Gentiles died in Auschwitz.
Same way, Poles. Or were they killed differently?
It was quite unusual for Poles who arrived in Auschwitz, mostly arrived as political prisoners. Very few Polish children arrived, only late in 1944 after the Warsaw uprising of the city of Warsaw. So you didn't really have those children and old people arriving who would be subjected to a selection. So people died there in gas chambers as a result of a selection in the camp.
I'm going to ask you one last question. Give me the 3 main reasons why you won the trial.
I think it's maybe one main reason. I mean, and that is because ultimately the evidence is there. There is such an overwhelming evidence for Auschwitz. And when we started the trial, we were talking to the lawyers, and Richard Rampton, the Queen's Counsel, basically told me, this is the first and last case I will have in my life we simply cannot lose. And I said, why can't we lose this case? Every case can be lost. And he said, because we have the evidence. And so I think that's a very simple answer. Holocaust deniers don't have the evidence. That's the problem they have. They have all kinds of theories, but ultimately, if you don't have the evidence, you don't have history.
Dr. Van Pelt, how did this change you, if it did?
The trial itself, or the work on Auschwitz?
The trial.
there's a you know, I always wanted as a young boy, every Dutch boy always wants to become a tugboat captain. You know, I mean, that is the national myth is about, you know, going out in the sea and rescuing some kind of merchant ship which is on the rocks. And I felt for, you know, that those months or those days that I was on the cross-examination, that I was really doing something very important. And it is, you know, as a historian, most of the time, you know, you basically work away and you teach your classes and you write your books. You said people don't really care. At that moment, people really cared, and that's a nice moment in your life.
Thank you very much, Dr. Van Pelt. We really appreciate it. And that's our show for tonight. Thank you for joining us. And don't forget, we're always interested in what you have to say. So if you have a question or comment about the show, call us at 713-743-8513 or send us an email at theconnection@HoustonPBS.org. Thank you once again for joining us.